Welcome, everybody, to this fine year, 2022, getting started with a podcast, the Medicine Trails podcast, with my brother, Steve Egger. How are you today, Steve?
I'm wonderful. How about you, Alex?
Oh, I'm fantastic. It's a beautiful day here we're having in Southern California. The weather is certainly beautiful, cannot complain. And I understand it is cold up there, up in the deep north. Is that true?
It is still cold, yeah. Winter is definitely here.
Winter is here. Well, let's get started. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. We have a discussion topic in mind, which is about the new Earth and this shift that is underway right now. This has been a topic I've thought about for many, many years. I think I spent most of my time in the years leading up to 2012, 10 years ago now, which is amazing to think about. 10 years since the great end of the Mayan calendar. I never really anticipated or thought about what 2022 was going to be like. It was just kind of like, okay, in the year 2012, there's going to be this big shift and the poles will change and the ascension will happen. There's so many different ways to approach this subject. And I'm really interested to hear what you think right off the bat. What is your take? What does this mean to you? A new Earth, a shift in this consciousness of planet Earth?
Before we go right into this, like you mentioned 2012, like I still have a vivid memory of the year 2000 when we all thought the computers will crash and the world will end, and it's been kind of a constant topic, or been on my mind constantly, and 2020 was one of those years, where the future was so uncertain. We didn't know where this is gonna go, and you could kind of feel the anxiety in the air. And granted, I was still much younger back then, but it kind of got ingrained into my brain. And then we came to the year 2012, and again, you could kind of feel that anxiety, but also a lot of hope. Talks about pole shifts, volcanoes, earthquakes, and now we're here, like you said, 10 years later, 2022, and it seems like we're in a bigger mess than we've ever been in. It's fascinating, actually.
It's super fascinating. Super fascinating. And all those things, volcanoes, earthquakes. Also, another thing is these massive solar ejections that are anticipated to happen, and they come in cycles. So there are periods of more solar activity and then down waves, and there's interesting fields of research that go into what is the understanding the relationship between these massive solar ejections and sun activity to what's happening on Earth. And some people would say, it's one or the other, that the sun's activity affects life on Earth. But I also think that since everything is connected in this whole one field of consciousness, it's our activity on Earth also can influence the sun. So there's this two-way street in terms of our relationship to the environment. And yes, there is a lot of scary stuff that could potentially happen in regard to Earth changes. And, something that comes to mind with Earth shifts and consciousness changing is that, unlike in the year 2012 and leading up to it, I was really just mostly focused on those things. Like there's going to be this big shift, and there's going to be, as the ascension prophecies, and even in the book of Revelations, I believe it is, talking about the rapture, this idea of the good people will go to heaven and the bad people will go to hell, or there'll be a judgment of some kind. The way things are now in the world, I think you can see, if depending on where you look and how you look at it, you can see all of these things happening on the spectrum of positive things and negative things. And like I was saying before about the relationship part, I think to me, one of the most underrated aspects of shifts is that it's a shift in consciousness. And depending on how you look at it, you can either see the end of the world happening, because there's plenty of evidence for that with the pandemic and the restrictions and the mandates and the earth changes and the extreme weather, and you could the poverty and everything, like war. You could see all the negative stuff, but at the same time, you could, if you look at it, you can see a really amazing positive shift happening, like what's going on with this convoy in Canada and around the world. There are people, for lack of a better term, waking up to this idea of sovereignty in our consciousness, that we are being moved along into a world that requires us to be subjugated. But there are so many people that are becoming attentive and having awareness to this idea. Well, no, maybe I don't want to just go along with the herd and do what is being pushed, what is pushed upon us. Maybe I can make my own decision about how I see the world. And so that's a positive thing. I think that the shift is really, in a lot of ways, in the eye of the beholder. Depending on how you look at it, you'll be able to see it that way. If you're looking for it, that's how you'll see it. And the last thing I'll say in that note is, the more people that share a view of the world, the more likely that view of the world will become a reality. So when we all start to come together and share some kind of common perspective about the world, that's when that world will come to be. So if everyone's in chaos and fear, then we'll start to see more of a fearful based world. But if we start to come together in love and harmony, then we're going to see that as well. So we are certainly not passive observers of this shift, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Like I read somewhere, it said, if you wouldn't watch the news, you wouldn't know that there is a pandemic. And, living up here in the north, it kind of reiterated that, when we lived in the city before we moved up north here to the bush, you were constantly reminded of the fear that kind of has gripped humanity, and you were kind of subjugated to this energy field, to this vibration of fear. But up here, where we don't really have any neighbors close by, like where we live, you can't see any neighbors' houses. And so if you just spend time on the land, like the sun rises in the morning, even though everything is covered in snow, the deers are walking around, the birds are still flying, the squirrels are still up in the trees, like life here, it didn't have an impact on natural life in a sense, not like human beings can have obviously an impact on nature and life in nature. But if you just look at nature in itself, the cycle of life it goes on, it has not been interrupted. While it feels like for human beings, due to political mandates and all that, like the cycle of life, in a sense, it has been interrupted. Like most important things, like physical contact, social connections, spending time with your loved ones, those things came to a screeching halt, if you so will. It's absolutely fascinating in a sense that there's this one side of reality that is like telling you that death is imminent, and we hardly have a chance to evade it, besides, this new technology of vaccinations, and to do everything that is, how do I word this, that is so contradictory to human nature, breathing fresh air, like I mentioned before, social connections, human interactions. So then we have this side, the doom, gloom, and everything is lost. But then on the other hand, we have this natural world where life is going forward, it's moving like it has each and every day. If you think about, if you look in the past, you know, we had wars happening all the time, nations fighting each other, different groups of people against different groups of people. There has always been like this side of death, violence, blood, doom, gloom. But behind it all, you know, this human misery that we keep perpetuating, you have life, you have love, you have the energy of the universe, of the cosmos, of the creator. And it's always been moving, ever going forward, you know? And I speak about this often. I feel like there has been a deliberate attempt to disconnect humanity from this side so that we're stuck over here constantly, you know, in this perpetuated hell. And I feel like, and you mentioned to it too, more and more people over here kind of start to see over there. It doesn't make that much sense anymore, you know, what's going on over here. And I think that's the new earth over here. You may be able to refer it, or you could refer to it as the old world as well. But for many of us, it will be new. But, you know, you can refer to it as the Garden of Eden if you want, you know, for convenience sake. But yeah, I feel more and more there's a pull that draws people over here, away from the constant misery, into another world, a new earth, so to speak.
Yeah. The perception of death too is important to discuss when it comes to all of these shifts in consciousness, in the cycles of natural world of seasons and everything like that. The thing is, nature is more cyclical than it is linear. And that is perfectly demonstrated in the change of the seasons, where you have new life coming up in the spring, and then it blossoms in the summer, and then it starts to fall and autumn, and everything appears to be dying. But in reality, it's not dying. It's just going in through a transitionary phase to hibernate. So then there's the winter, which is, you know, there's really no green or anything like that. There still is life, but it appears to be dead. And then, of course, it's reborn again. There's this constant cycle of birth and death happening in nature, and we are completely risen up from nature. So how is it any different than us? And the big thing is, it's not. And a lot of it has to do with this big fear of death and a misperception, in my opinion, that death and life are opposites of each other. I would say more so that death and birth are opposites of each other, and that they are both included within the framework of life itself, because life, just like fungus and mushrooms, they are vital for the ecosystem of Earth, where they help break down and the decaying matter so that can be reintegrated into the soil for things to grow again. So death as the end of existence is a misperception, and the big fear about that, which you alluded to, that we're being deliberately kept in that world of death and the end and fear, is something that's been around for thousands and thousands of years, ostensibly since the beginning of what we consider to be civilization, which was, you know, roughly 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. But as the evidence is starting to come in here in the last 10, 20 years, really, there is more evidence to show that there was life and civilization going on before what we consider the beginning. So an interesting thing I always think about is in terms of what's happening today, is what happened back then. What was precipitating the end of a civilization and the rise of a new one? And I feel like we're in a very similar place right now. And something that is being called upon us to do, I really do believe, is to come to terms and face what this fear of death really is. Because the imminent, like in the pandemic and the media and everything, it's this fear, well, everyone's going to die. And of course, there's a biological imperative that wants to keep you alive. You know, there's a purpose to you know, not run into the jaws of death. Just because you have no fear of death doesn't mean you should be jumping off cliffs all the time necessarily. So there is a reason to preserve life, but a lot of what indigenous cultures have within their way of life is this acknowledging of death and basically having an experience or some sort of ritual ceremony, whether it's through meditation or connecting with nature, fasting, psychedelic experiences that allow you to really have a simulated near-death experience, so to speak. And then you come back with this new vision and you're no longer afraid anymore. So there's this fear of keeping us all like, oh my God, death is imminent. We need to avoid that. That's the opposite of what we want. We want life. However, if we were to understand really what death is all about, and in terms of the shift and the coming down, then we can actually have more freedom and being able to live without fear. Because if we die, which we all will, that's one of the common things we all share as human beings. We're all going to die one day. And there is this idea of the creator and that there is all this oneness. So when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. If we could save lives and prevent suffering and extend life, then that's great. That's like growing a garden, taking care of a garden. We could take care of our lives and improve the quality of life. But at the same time, we shouldn't be afraid of death. And we are experiencing the death of a civilization right now that has been going on for so long. And there are those that are desperately trying to stop that from happening, literally hooking people up to machines to keep them alive. And in the end, really, how well does that do with preserving life? I think I guess what I'm trying to say is that a big part of this shift is recognizing that we're all going to die, and we need to accept that, but also learn from it. There's a lot to be learned when we are no longer living in a perpetual state of fear. So that is one of the biggest shifts I think that's happening in consciousness right now.
Yeah. And like we had with our son Noah, when they told us at the 20-week ultrasound that we should abort him, that he will never live because he had an issue with his urinary tract. The doctors are not even quite sure what the issue really was and where the blockage was, but he couldn't pee when he was in utero. So there was the fear that which was well granted, when you can't pee, the amniotic fluid can form. So they kind of told us that he has no chance to be born alive, pretty much. But then we did a ceremony where a beautiful elder came and assisted, helped, and did the ceremony with us. And during the ceremonies, one of the grandfathers that came in said very clearly that no human being can decide who's going to live or who's going to die, that only the creator makes that decision. And I think as human beings, we kind of run into the dangers of playing the creator a little bit too much. And I find that quite scary in a sense, we kind of lost the faith, we lost faith into the natural timing, and now, you can see it, this medicine that they're giving people now, people are still dying even though they have received this medicine, that's not, it's not how you say that, it's inevitable or whatever the word is. Like you can't change your allotted time to return home to the creator. It doesn't matter if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how many doses you want to administer yourself. If it is your time to go home, it's your time to go home. And it just shows us how powerful fear is, and how it is used as a weapon, to manipulate actions, to manipulate people, behaviors. It's even used to pin people against each other, This pandemic unfortunately has split many people apart, you know, not just relationships, but families, loved ones. And I think that's one of the biggest tragedies during this whole thing, you know, how divided we have become. But in a sense, it's also kind of a blessing, because it does show us the two different worlds, you know. And I believe, you know, all hardships are blessings in disguise. I know they are. And so eventually something good will come out of this too. It has to, because the good will always emerge victorious at the end. You know, fear of death in itself is a humongous topic. But if you look at nature, and I want to refer back to nature again, when you see a deer grazing peacefully, and then that deer perceives a threat, the deer runs away as fast as he can. And that's the biological response you talked about, you know, to preserve life. But then as soon as the threat, the predator disappears, the deer stops and eats grass again, peacefully. I think human beings are the only beings in nature that hold on to fear, you know? I mean, it's absolutely natural. And if you cross the street and you don't see the truck and the truck almost hits you, to jump out of the way and to get yourself in safety. But then afterwards, we got to learn to come back into a state of calm. And that's another thing that pandemic has shown us, like this stress, like that the people have been experienced over the last 2 years will have so many adverse health reactions. Because if we constantly hold on to chronic fear and stress, it's detrimental to our health, to our overall well-being. And you can see it, like mental health issues are absolutely on the rise. Suicides are on a rise. Yeah. I have to apologize for a quick second. I'm not the most technically literate person here. I need to plug in this computer, which I should have done before.
Well, that's interesting too, that a computer has batteries and needs to be recharged. And that story that you just mentioned about the deer and having a fight or flight response essentially and getting away is necessary to do, and then you return back to life. So we've almost been, I mean, just like that computer, we haven't had a time to replug ourselves back into the source, which is nature, for so long, and it's draining us. And that perpetual state of fear is a completely unnatural state of existence, and it's so detrimental. Stress creates chemistry in our bodies that literally makes us sick, and that is one of the most under discussed ideas that we need to be bringing back into the conversation as a population, because we're looking outside at the environment. Like the thing is that biological response to jump out of the way of the car is important, but that car isn't even really there for most people. It's really just the perception of that car is going to be hitting me constantly. It's just manufactured stress and anxiety. And the thing is, we're so much more easily manipulated when we are under stress. And that is a trick of the trade that goes back thousands of years when it comes to manipulating populations of people. When people are isolated, vulnerable, and under stress, they seek a savior. And that's just the way things have been going for a long time. We forget that. We don't really know our history as a people on this planet. Like, and all the things too that you mentioned before with this propagation of this stuff. It comes also from this idea of the struggle for life, the Darwinian approach to evolution as being this is a competition and a struggle for life, implying directly that life is a constant struggle, like two animals fighting each other, that's the primordial force that's running nature. And I completely disagree with that. That's an aspect of nature, but not what drives nature. Nature is driven by the cooperation of the community of all the organisms in the environment working together in harmony. That's the thing, is you don't have to teach animals to live in harmony with their environment. It just comes naturally to them. Us as human beings, we have to nurture each other and teach each other about life. So there's the stories that we tell ourselves about how to live. And sometimes these stories can be really good, and sometimes they can be really detrimental and just produce more stress. So there's a positive aspect to that programming for human beings, even though we're the only ones that do that, because it allows us to have an advantage of adaptability, because the environment changes so much. That gives us that self-awareness that we can adapt to the environment. But there has absolutely been effort from, frankly, small groups of people in positions of what's considered to be authority, using that knowledge to exploit other people, the environment, nature. It's this exploitation, using knowledge to exploit. That has been one of the big problems. And when it comes to the shift of consciousness, you look at the back of the American dollar and it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. There's an awareness of this shift of consciousness that's happening, but that knowledge has been coveted and kept secret and kept so deep within layers and layers of initiation that a very small group of people know about it and are using it to exploit this change of the ages. Because harmony and working together like a nature and a garden as one living organism, that is a beautiful vision. But the other side of it is a one government that basically controls everything. So there's this shift that's happening that people have known about for thousands of years, that has just been exploited for the intention of basically perpetuating this illusion of separation. And it's a beautiful thing to see that when people become aware of these truths by going through their own rites of passage and learning new things and trial and error of cultivating wisdom within. There's really no one way to make this change. It's very personal way that this can be done. And I'm just optimistic that so many people are kind of coming to that conclusion on themselves. They don't need some sort of outside source to tell them that there's a shift going on. Everyone can feel it in one way or another. So and I'll just say this last thing I'll say on that. We talk about fear. I say this is one of my mantras for the year, but it's from Dune. It's, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it is gone, I will turn my inner eye to see its path. And where fears come, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. And that is just a beautiful story of self-empowerment, facing your fears, not running away from them, but then recognizing that you are in command of what is to be seen or not. You have the choice to recognize that your environment is just a stimulus pushing your buttons. And if you're afraid, you can actually control the buttons on your system. We don't have to react to the fear. So that is a big part of it. We don't have to react to the fear. Most of the fears are totally fabricated and manufactured in today's world. So that's a good thing to know, that it's really just this layer of fear that's keeping us apart and sick. And once we get rid of that fear, then it's like, okay, well, we don't really have to make a new world. Like you said, the new world is going to be new for some people, but that's the old world. That's the natural world of nature. So it's already there. We don't have to make it. We already it's a lot more simple than we care to imagine, you know?
No, absolutely. And the interesting thing about fear, like if we look at like feelings and emotions, the difference between feelings and emotions is that an emotion is a feeling that we have a story attached to it. And that's also like important to understand in this context. So let's say we just recently met a girl and we really like this girl. And we just started dating, and one day you walk down the street, and you see the girl that you just started dating. She's walking down on the other side of the street, and a boy approaches, or a man, whatever. And the girl gives the boy a kiss on the cheek. Your first feeling would be maybe sadness, like, or, like, what is going on, kind of. But then you attach a story to it. Oh, she's betraying me. She's cheating on me. And it is the story that you attach to the feeling that feeds the emotion that makes everything spiral out of control. So for the sake of the story, the boy that came down the street and received a kiss on his cheek was actually her brother, but he never met her brother because you just started dating. But see, what I want to get at here is our mind is conditioned to create stories to make sense out of situations that we can't make sense of or we don't know the answer to. And I think this is wildly exploited too, you know, in how to control people, like via maybe the news channels and stuff that we get presented to us each and every day through the media. And because when it all first started, you know, and this virus came out, it was understandable that people are worried, you know, because we didn't know where this was headed. But then those feelings were manipulated through stories, you know, that went so far now that they're blaming the small minority of unvaccinated people that want to make their own choices, maybe it for spiritual reason, medical reasons, to pin them to like, to start like commotion between groups of people. Which is totally unwarranted. If you look at all the numbers worldwide, which clearly state there's not a big difference if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, how this virus has an effect on you. You know, and I don't, we could speculate for hours why this might be that those stories are fed to the people so they're manipulated. I just find it interesting to point out, you know.
Yeah. Science is interesting because there's that catchphrase that's thrown around a lot. Trust the science. If you start to break down what that means, like you said, there's something like an event or situation, the environment, and then the story that's attached to it. So in this situation, in this case, you've got that phrase, trust the science. And what's the story attached to that? There's a story that is really not thought about and discussed, at least in, of course, mainstream media, about what science really is. Science is not one single body of authority. There are tons of scientists, and science is based on disagreement and doubt and questioning things. And that is really important to be able to do that. And of course, you know, there's not everyone agrees, but you could look at ratios of the amount of people that agree on one thing and the amount of people that don't agree. And and that's important to recognize those ratios when it comes to science. It's a conversation, and we need to be able to have this free flow of information. Yeah. It's just, and it's an interesting thing about science too, is we tend to think, based on the story of history we've been programmed to accept, is that first there was religion and then science evolved from religion, because it comes from this idea that we start off very primitive, and there's just this ever expanding growth of and development, and it start, you know, like first it was bacteria, and then eventually you get to the human body, or first you're doing little cavemen, and then eventually they're living in mansions on the beach. But the story of civilization as it's unfolding now, and the way we have the evidence coming in, is that it turns out it didn't actually start off with religion, that there was actually science that came first, which is the concept of learning to know and understand the environment. Ancient people studied the stars. Ancient people studied the seasons and nature. They were keen observers of nature, and that is what allowed them to build all of the megalithic structures, to be able to predict the seasonal changes, when to grow crops and everything. That's a science. That's a science. And you can even see in certain cultures, like in ancient Egypt, there's a complete change in the way that we see it, like I just described, where instead of seeing primitive to more and more advanced in Egypt, you have really, really advanced, and then it gets less advanced over time and degraded. So that doesn't really add into the story. So it's funny when we look at what science really is. Science is this idea of learning to know things and observe the environment. And now we seem to be associating science in the same way that a religion used to be associated. Well, you trust in God and you trust in the sources like the priests and the popes and stuff like that. They're going to tell you what the will of God is and that you don't have a connection to it. And you got to trust them. You can't read Latin. They're the ones that interpret everything. And you got to take their word for it. This is kind of how science is becoming. Science is become a religion of the world today. We're forgetting what science really means. And it's just interesting that the ancient people that we have lost touch with, our memory with, they started with science, and religion came after we fell apart and stopped observing the environment and learning from it. And then we had to, that, like, religion is almost like a product of the Dark Ages, really.
Yeah. And I mean, the science that they had, like, it's initiatic science. We actually wouldn't need any books at all, because we have the greatest book there is, the living book of nature. You know, everything that there is to know is in the living book of nature. We just have to know how to look and how to perceive the teachings that are in this living book of nature. And, you know, like how you mentioned about science today, I think the problem with science is that the focus is too much on analyzing and dissecting things. And this is, it symbolizes death, you know? If you really want to understand something, you can't take it apart into small, tiny little pieces and just look at a small, tiny piece and then say, oh, I understand what's going on here. If you want to really understand what's transpiring or what is happening, you need to look at the whole picture and a holistic approach. You know, you need to look at every little aspect as everything is connected. And I think that's a good segment to talk a little bit more about the shift, you know, because those are the two different worlds, the analytic, dissecting, and the all-encompassing holistic.
We have these perfectly demonstrated and reflected. I mean, that is all reflection of what's happening inside of our brains. We have a right and left hemisphere of our brain. One side is analytic, which is the left, and sees details and looks in things in terms of logic and linear progression, one thing after the other. Whereas the right brain is completely seeing the complete picture, and it's more image based and emotional based. Like there's thoughts versus emotions, and we're constantly being provoked to choose one. One is the correct one and the other one is the enemy. And this even is demonstrated with the proverbial angel and the devil on your shoulders, where one side is telling you this and the other side's telling you that. And one side's good, one side's bad. These are all convoluted in a lot of ways. But the thing about nature is that nature is both of these things combined. It would be amazing if we could be able to recognize the big picture, how everything fits into a wholeness, and then be able to also understand, okay, what are the placements of this? Because if you look at a garden and how it's all holistically collaborating in a diverse way, as a single unit, then you can start to, okay, well, which plants are producing this effect? Well, these plants do fruits. These plants are for herbs. These things do that. That's like the good nature of recognizing the specialization, the delineation, because then you can take a seed from one thing and plant it over here. That's a good aspect of the logic part. Yeah. But then look at that blown completely out of proportion now, where they're just destroying any sort of diverse gardens and they're building these giant monocrop fields. That's just too far in the other direction of the left brain or the dissecting thing. And one of my favorite films of all time is the Dark Crystal, Jim Henson's amazing puppet masterpiece. I think it was actually the first feature film to have no human beings in it. It was all puppets. And that was an amazing story ahead of its time, where you have these two different races, essentially, that came originally from one. You have the Skeksis, who were the harsh, cruel, twisted, centralized, oppressive force. And then you have the mystics, who are like these indigenous wise masters who are kind of spread out across the land. And the great prophecy is when they come back together. And in this example here, science as the dissecting analytic part needs to come together and recognize the wholeness that emerges in this understanding of spirituality, how it's all one. It's not one or the other. They need to come together and recognize, like you said, science needs to recognize, okay, how does this all fit into a into a wholeness here. There are so many doctors and fields of specialization. You got a heart doctor, you got a cancer doctor, you've got a foot doctor, you got a dentist, you got all these people that are like, oh, okay, well, I got something wrong with my heart. Okay, well, we're going to have to send you to this guy to figure it out. Oh, well, we studied your heart, and now we got to, now your lungs, we need to send you to a pulmonologist or some other kind of doctor to figure that out. And you're going around all these different things whereas the holistic way of approaching it is like, how often do doctors even ask you, if you come into a doctor's office, if you find yourself in there, well, what's your family life like? How much stress is your job bringing you? What are you eating? Do you get enough sleep? What's the relationship with your family like? You know, these are all completely important when you look at the big picture, and and science has become this very compartmentalized way of looking at things. So it seems that we're a part of the shift is people coming to the realization through experience, through direct personal experience, that the healer is within, that all of these things are connected. And if you want to have a healthy life, you can't just rely on one specific aspect of it. Yeah. So holism is clearly the direction, I think, that we are moving towards and need to be moving more as a community into.
Yeah. And, you know, like that movie you just spoke about, but the whole symbolism behind it is, and I think this ties in to the whole discussion we have here, is like this old society that we've been living on has been very focused on the mind. You know, everything is about schooling, academics, who's the smartest in the room, how much can we cram in here? And we have totally neglected the heart. You know, and if you just let your mind, like if you just solely focus on your mind and you neglect the heart, then there's quite obviously an imbalance. There's like an old story which fits perfectly here, but there was once a garden with beautiful fruit trees, and close to the wall on the side of the garden was a humongous apple tree. And it was quite a high wall, but the apples were kind of hanging over it. And so one day the farmer realized that most of the apples on the side of the tree were gone. And they wondered, like, what happened, you know? So they kind of investigated, and after a while they found a blind man. And a man, give me one quick second, I have to think about it. There was a blind man and a man who had no arms. They were on the side of the road. So they took those two people and they brought them in front of a judge. And they had discussions, and after a while they said, we're convinced it was the blind man who stole our apples. But then the judge said, how could it be that a blind man steals your apples? He cannot even see the apples. And so they kept talking again. And then they said, we're convinced it was the man with no arms that stole our apples. And after a while, the judge, thinking, said, how can that be? Like, he has no arms. And it's interesting to note that the blind man is our mind, and the person with no arms is our heart. He had no legs. He had arms, but no legs. It's been a long time since I heard that story, but it just comes back to me now. It symbolizes the heart. So they had more and more discussions till finally one person said, I understand now how it worked. The man with no legs sat on the blind man's shoulder. And this is how they got the apples down. And, you know, this story is kind of how you say it, analogy? Like it points out that the mind and the heart need to work together. You know, the heart knows where it wants to go in life. Like if you really listen to our heart, it knows where it wants to go. And that's how I remembered the story correctly, because the heart knows, but the heart doesn't know how to get there. It can't get there by itself. And that's why we need the mind. And the mind in itself is blind, you know. Sometimes we get something in our head and we want to go achieve it, but we're blinded. We don't know how we're going to get it, and we get hurt in the process. But if you have the heart and the mind together, you can see where you want to go in life, and you can figure out how you're going to get there without hurting yourself or other people. So I think that's going to be the new earth as well. People that have their mind and their hearts connected. Over here, we're too much in our head. You know, everything is about thinking and ego and analyzing, like we talked about. But we would also run into an issue if this side itself would only be focused on the heart and steered by the heart. So we need both together, mind and heart, spirit and soul, thoughts and feelings in harmony. You know, you kind of talked about it before, like we're marvelous human beings. We have a masculine side, a feminine side, giving and receiving, mind and heart. And we have to bring this together so that we can really, truly create something new. And I think more and more we're inching into this direction of achieving like a new way of being, a new way of thinking and feeling, a new way of living, so to speak, you know. Because over here we see a mountain full of ore or whatever might be in there, and at this point we're just thinking, how much can we get out of this mountain? How much will it make us? How many people do we need to hire? Will there be some upset people? How can we keep them quiet? But we're not listening here, you know. What kind of nature spirits may live on this mountain? How will it affect the landscape? What impact will it have somewhere else in the world? Because everything is connected. There's this Bulgarian spiritual master, Omra Mekel Ivanov, who took his students down to the lake on the Rila Mountains, and he had his followers wash rocks, really gentle. And one day, one of the students was asking, like, why are you bringing us down here day after day to wash those rocks, you know? And he basically explained to them that because everything is connected, the act of loving and kindly washing the stone will have a positive impact somewhere else in the world that we cannot even understand yet, you know? And I think we have forgotten about all those things. That's when we just think with our head and profit and money, we feel like we have the right to do whatever we want as long as it fills our pocket. And I think that's kind of why we're in this mess too. And if you think that the whole system of time and money is another interesting aspect that I would like to go into quickly if we have a little bit more time.
We sure do.
We've been living in artificial time for a long period now. If you think about the timing frequency of 1260, you know, 12 months to 60 minutes a day, is essentially time is money. We're bound to the clock. We got to go. And it's an unhealthy, unnatural timing frequency. And this timing frequency is represented over here. Over here, we have the 1320. Some people refer to this one as 1328. I think it's mostly referred to as 1320, which is the natural time frequency. Time is art. 13 moons a year to 28 days each, with 1 day of rest. And that's what they had in the old days, you know, the lunar calendars, which is much more natural. And interestingly enough, more and more awareness comes out, you know, in regards to those two timing frequencies. You know more about than I do about like how those calendars were invented, you know, the Caesars kind of being on power trips, wanting their own months. So the guy just kind of shuffled days around and called it Augustus because that was his name. Which all comes out of the mind again, you know, egos created this timing frequency that we live in. And again, I I know that it was a tool used to enslave humanity, to take them out of the healing frequency, the natural frequency that we're actually supposed to live in.
Yeah, well, time itself is one of the aspects that keeps us imprisoned in a belief. Beliefs are, like we've talked about earlier on this podcast, the stories that we tell ourselves and associate to events, people, and things. And that's, out of all the things that we don't own, life is a gift. Even our bodies, we return to the earth one day. The one thing that we can say, I think we do own, or we should really learn about what kind of ownership we do have, is the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. And the perception of death is one of these big fears. But then another one is time. Time is absolutely a prison moment. We talk about the present moment, but it's a prison moment, because we're not actually living in the moment, and we see it as a linear string where the past is behind us and the future is in front of us, and we're constantly trying to control the future. And that's like with the ancient Romans and how they had to create these calendar systems, modify calendar systems for ego and mind, and also to think about the context of trying to control populations and keeping things and functioning as a whole, because that was such a revolutionary time when it came to religion, spirituality, thought, class systems, making sure as new cultures and cults would arise and move over here and change their beliefs. Okay, well, they still want to celebrate this holiday, but that holiday doesn't fit into our calendar system. So let's take this holiday, put it into our religion. And it's like the game of telephone. Over time, now the calendar system we have now has nothing to do with nature whatsoever. But there was all originated around community, and time itself is, in my opinion, more like a community. If you look at past, present, future as a community, as opposed to a linear string of separate things where we can't change the past, we can't see the future, and here we are in the present moment, just kind of walking blindly to death as we, never will see it coming. And I think maybe if we talked about this before, the ancient Greeks, the way they saw time was the opposite of how we see it, where we imagine the future is in front of us, but they saw the future is behind them and the past is in front of you, because you can recall and remember and perceive the past like as if you're looking at it like a memory. And it's the future that's lurking up behind you, that no matter how much you try to look behind you, you'll never see it coming up. And the shift of moving the future into the front was based on this effort of, like, maybe a good intention of, let's try to be able to control our destiny a little bit. Let's not just keep repeating the same things over and over again. Let's take command over our destiny, kind of a thing. That's a nice idea. But in the process of doing that pole shift, which is a shift in itself, our perception of time, of moving the past behind us, we literally took everything that we know about who we are, where we came from, and forgot about it, deliberately forgot about it in an attempt to control the future. And time itself is, if we recognize it, the past and the future don't really exist, so to speak. Those are constructs in our consciousness. We're in this present moment. And probably one of the best things to do is to let go of this idea that you got to put the future in front of you to control it. And this idea that you can't change the past. The past is finite, but ultimately, past is a memory. Past is a perception of an event. It's all about our perception. And if, let's say, you were in a car accident, a traumatic car accident, and it's in your past, you probably can't change the car accident. You can't necessarily change the event. And when people think you can't change the past, that's what they always think. Like, I can't literally stop the car accident from happening. If I could build a time machine, go back and stop myself from getting in the car accident, I can change my destiny. But the real amazing magic happens when you realize that you can change your perception and how you react to that event in the past. Therefore, instead of being in a traumatic, post-traumatic state from a car accident, you can actually see it as a learning lesson. You can change it so it no longer controls you through fear. Again, fear is the mind killer. Fear is the present killer. Fear keeps you in a prison. Fear is what keeps you from keeps you avoiding death, and fear is what keeps you from really embracing the present moment. So when we learn that we can really change our perceptions and change the course of history itself, change our memory of history, then you start to see that's what really I think this shift is all about. I think the biggest shift is an internal shift in our consciousness and how we perceive the world. And all of the stuff that is shaking and coming down with environmental catastrophe underway right now, it's not that nature is punishing us necessarily. I think we need to recognize that this is a direct consequence of ourselves not living in harmony with nature. And the environment is telling you, no, this is not how you do it. But it doesn't mean the end of the world. And it doesn't mean that this is the end. Because if you look at a place like Chernobyl in Russia or Siberia, I think it is, where the nuclear catastrophe explosion happened back in the late 80s.
Wasn't that in
Ukraine or Soviet?
Yeah, that was in Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine. So, yeah, if you look at that place, it was an exclusion zone. No humans can go there anymore. It's a dead place. But now if you look at pictures of Chernobyl, you see that now that humans have stepped out and stopped messing with, building roads and having nuclear reactors and stuff, the place is completely growing back. Nature has come back, and there is even black fungus growing inside of the nuclear reactor in a place that they said no life can exist here. There is life inside of the reactor, and animals are coming back, and then they're not animals that are like walking around with 3 eyeballs and stuff. Yeah. The thing is when we stop doing all that stuff, nature will grow back. We have to stop that and change our perception of this end of existence stuff, because when we get out of the way of nature and start to learn to live in harmony with ourselves and nature, then the garden comes back. And it comes back really quickly, despite all odds and fears that are projected on it. So it really starts with changing our perception of this whole thing and recognizing that even when there's a crisis, there is a purpose to that crisis. And that crisis is there to teach us something. Mm-hmm. And we've been running away from these teachings left and right, running away from the teaching of death, running away from the teaching of time, running away from the teaching of community. And that's the last thing in these 3 pillars of prison moment perceptions of separation is our idea of community. We've been programmed to believe by individuals, organizations, and just traumatic events in our distant past to believe that we're alone, when that couldn't be farther from the truth. We are not alone. We are in a giant community of human beings with animals, nature, like the rocks, going and washing the rocks. These things are alive, and we're in a relationship community with them. We're in a relationship with other planets and other beings and other places. This is a gigantic community. When we are programmed and live in this idea that we are alone and separate, that again is how we are manipulated. It is when you're in a vulnerable place and isolated from the world in your mind, in your community, then you can easily be, anything can happen. Anything can happen when you're cut off from that. So community is a huge part of this shift that is underway right now. I think it's coming back into community, into that holistic understanding that we're all in this together, and not just the people, but the rocks, the trees, the plants, the animals, everything.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, in conclusion, because I think our hour is up pretty much, but there has been prophecies about the crossroads, where it either leads to destruction or to a new way of being. And just to kind of summarize what we all talked about, and just some things that you kind of like referred to just now, we have the personality, which are our base desires, and we have our individuality, which is our higher selves. We've been stuck over here too much in our personality. I want, take, And here we have our individuality, who is of service, giving, loving, kind, and only thinks of the greater good of all beings of life. I think we're at this crossroad now, and we have to acknowledge that we can't wait for any saviors. Jesus won't come magically down from heavens and set everything right. we have to find it within ourselves, you know. In the Bible, in the Apocalypse, I think, they talk about the new Jerusalem coming down on earth, and it has 12 gates. Oddly enough, the human being has 12 gates. We have 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, 1 here, 1 on our belly button, and then each male and female, we have 2 more down here. If you count 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, where's the 12th? 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 12. Which one's the 12th one? But we do have 12 gates on us. And I think the new Jerusalem, how they would refer it to in the Bible, is our being, you know. And it's important now that we step forward, taking care of those gates, you know, see good things, speak good things, hear good things. And that's what like First Nations communities refer to when they smudge and say, this is why we smudge our eyes, our ears, our mouths. Oh, the 12th to 12.
Right.
Belly button, the nipples. But now we're going into like some very deep esoteric science and initiatic science on referring to those things as gates, which we maybe can go into in another episode. But what I was trying to say here, the important thing is that we understand we are the ones that we have been waiting for, you know. We are the new Jerusalem. We can embody the consciousness of Christ, and we don't need to wait for somebody else to come back. And ultimately, I think the second coming that many are waiting for, you know, you see it even now because times are dire, people are afraid. Lots of times you see comments, please come now, we need the second coming, Christ, where are you? And he even said in the Bible, Jesus, the man, said in the Bible, what I can do, so can you, and much more. And I think we have to step out of this place where they tell us you can't do anything without us telling you what to do. You are powerless. You need to be in fear. Only think about yourself. We need to step out of this, because what we can accomplish in here, what we can find to build this new world, that's what we need to do. We need to step out of this. We need to discover that we're all beings of light, that we're all sons and daughters of God, you know, and not to parade on the Christian. Jesus was God's son, but so are we. He brought the message, but we can bring this message too. You know, he was a man that over reincarnations purified himself, worked on himself, that eventually his body was able to receive the Holy Spirit, Christ. But we can't put the responsibility of saving the planet, saving ourselves on just an individual himself. You know, we need to figure out that we also have this ability to work on ourselves, to cleanse ourselves, and to welcome in higher beings, higher spirits, in order to change ourselves and then also change the world around us, and in the process creating a new earth. I hope that all made sense. It was kind of like a scrambled podcast today.
I don't know. I like it. There's a lot of, I mean, I like that we're keeping it to an hour, but there was a good investment into these various branches of the tree that is the shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
And this ever-changing perception and tapping into all these different subjects. And that's a really important thing. And when we start to do that, when we take care of ourselves and we release the fear, we face it, recognize there's a purpose to it, and we step out of that 24/7, 365 fear and recognize nature as a growing living organism, because you can't be in growth and protection at the same time. So if we step out of protection, not throw it away because it's got an important function to it, but recognize that that program is so deeply embedded in our subconscious minds for generations and generations that we just believe that's the only way to live on this planet. Ironically, the only way to live on this planet is to be in the state of death and fear. It's just like when you start to break it down and use that analytical mind It's and which ironically, even though that's the civilization we have, it's based on that. We're almost being poised. Well, don't actually think about it anymore, because when you start actually paying attention to it, and you realize that you can see the invisible string holding up all of the apparatus that the magician is doing right now. It's coming so plainly obvious. And one last story I want to say, and we'll come to a conclusion here, is the story of somebody that has phantom limb syndrome, where their arm gets dismembered through some sort of horrible accident, whether it's in a war or whatever. Their arm is gone, but they experience a vice-like pain oftentimes, as if their arm is really there. They're feeling pain in their arm, but their arm is not there. Yeah. And there are very interesting ways to remedy this. And all it really requires is using a mirror and doing some peripheral eye exams in the mirror. So if you have an arm that's left arm is there and your right arm is missing, and you put the mirror up so that when you look out and through your peripheral vision, you can perceive the reflection of your other arm that's there. So instantaneously, the pain goes away when we have that moment of reflection. It's not like the arm had to come back in order to release the pain. All we had to do was reflect. And the magic of the community of the cells works it all out. And the connections get remade again. So as we go through life, it's like we're feeling that pain of a dismembered part of our being. But if we start to go through this reflection process and the ways that we've been talking about here, and we'll get into on following episodes, I'm sure, that pain goes away. And then we can start to live our lives again. And that is a beautiful thing about nature. Nature is life, and death and decay is part of life.
Yeah, I think next time we should dive a little bit more into the topic of, the cycle of life, dying, rebirth, and the fear surrounding it, because I think you and I both have good stories to share in that regard, and some things that we learned in the process of experiencing those stories, and maybe some teachings surrounding it.
Yeah, I like that. We'll do that for the next podcast. And for everyone that listened and followed us through to this point, just want to say thank you, and you are loved and appreciated, and congratulations on taking care of your health and enriching your mind and your hearts with positive things here. So, and if you're not, it's really cool that you're at least listening to it. Open up those gates and allow that magic to happen within you. And Steve, I want to thank you. I so appreciate doing these podcasts with you, and lots of love for you. And thank you again for everyone being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, like Alex said, if you take care of your health, that's amazing. If you don't, that's amazing too, in a sense, because we all have free will. That's the beautiful thing. To choose how we want to live. So I hope, don't offend anybody, but everybody's on their own journey, and that's a good thing. We're all on our own road with the creator that we have chosen, and we have to make our choices, and then we have to walk the path that we chose. But I mean, there's always a way to switch paths, That's also a good thing to keep in mind. Like, sometimes we don't make the best choices in life, but we can always switch onto another path.
Yeah. A path of balance. And that's a funny thing too, is that there's you go this way or you go that way. Well, in the reality of nature is balance. So that's what allows free will. And maybe it's not as much of an emphasis on which choice is the right choice, but learning to make both choices and to come to a third hidden conclusion, and esoteric Freemason symbols. You got the two pillars of knowledge and wisdom, but there is a third pillar that is not there, but it exists in your mind, in your heart. When you start to integrate these two, it's the hidden pillar of the third choice that comes when we live in balance. So yes, we could go on for days about all this stuff, and we will have more episodes. So thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.